Good evening. My name, as he said, is Dave Goodrich, and it's interesting. I'm thrilled to see so many people show up, especially in such a memorable place. As someone mentioned to me, the first people that came in tonight, that this is a forgotten jewel in Indianapolis. And that's very true. It really, really is. But then again, a lot of the history and the heritage and how we got to this place is a forgotten jewel in our culture. And that's why we're here, is to uncover that jewel again so that everybody can share in it. Now, the day we talk about, if you've seen any of the LibertySeed shirts running around, they say April 19th, 1775. Who here knows what day that was? What was important about it? Someone that isn't involved with the Revolutionary War Veterans Association. It's Patriots' Day. Not the Patriot Day we celebrate now, but Patriots' Day, and it's a much older holiday. It's the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It's the day that our country was born. And unlike so many other countries, so many other cultures or peoples, we can point to a day, a time, and a place. And we can say, that is where we became Americans. And to understand what happened that day and what made it a special day, we really have to begin where that day began. And that would be Lexington Green. Lexington, a small town outside of Boston, was on the road to Concord. And on the green that morning, if you can imagine being on the green that morning, everybody here has gotten up early at least once this week, right? You step out into that April morning. Imagine what it would have been like to be on Lexington Green. A green is just maybe a 5-acre park in the middle of town. To be out there just before dawn. It's not dark anymore, but night hasn't quite pulled its fingers away. You can feel that chill in the air of winter, but you can smell the earth, and you know it's springtime. And you're standing there on that green with 70 other men. Out of those 70 men, there are only 12 last names. Because if you looked up and down the row of those other men standing there, you would have seen your fathers, sons, uncles, cousins, neighbors. They were not strangers, those 70 men standing there. They knew intimately each other. They knew their kids' names. They knew where they lived. And they were standing there that morning because they were all members of Lexington's training band, the local militia, and they had been called out. They had been called out because they were told that General Gage, the royal governor of Boston, Massachusetts, was sending 800 men to Concord to take militia supplies. They had attempted this before, sometimes successfully, more often not successfully. And the Lexington Training Band was called out to be there on the green. And so they answered the call. Their commander, Captain John Parker, was neither the richest man, the smartest man, but they elected their commanders at the time. And he was an experienced man. He had fought before. He had a lot of life experience, and he was well respected for his level-headedness. And he was there on the green with them. And as those first rays of sun broke up just over the horizon, and it started to lighten up, and the chill started to lift, he turned to his men, and he gave them their orders. Do not fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. And they waited. They didn't wait long. Shortly after they fell out onto the green and they were prepared, riders came in and told them that the British troops were coming. The King's troops, because they were all British at the time, the King's troops were just up the road. And as they looked towards the road to Boston, they could see that line of shining silver bayonets in the morning sun as it came down on the road to Concord. And at the head of that column was an officer on a horse, and he turned the first few companies of that column, and he started marching them onto the green. as these 70 men of the Lexington training band watched. They weren't on their way to Concord now, they were coming towards them. Those first few companies came up in quick time. The officers started arraying them out in a firing position. And the second in command of the column, Major Pitcairn, and that young Irish Lieutenant Jesse Adair, who turned them onto the green, started riding up to the militia. And the words they spoke were, "Ye rebels, ye villains, lay down your arms and disperse," for doing something they had been doing for generations, assembling on the green as Lexington's training band. Captain Parker has his men there that morning under orders because they were there to make a show for these troopers, to let them know that they weren't going to come and just take their powder. But he also was an old Indian fighter, and he sees 200 or more men pouring onto the green, trained professional soldiers of His Majesty's Army, and he looks at his 70 men that he knows. Some of them he remembers as a child, and he knows that this is not the time or the place. The odds are not in their favor. And he tells his men, disperse. Take your weapons with you, but disperse. Go home. We'll have our chance. And the men turn to leave. Some of the men stay. One man throws his hat down, drops his powder horn and his musket ball in it, and says, "I will not move from this place." But most of the men turn to leave. And at some point, a shot rings out. If you ask those militiamen if we could go back to Lexington Green and ask them, they'd say they don't believe one of the King's troopers fired that shot. If you ask those officers, they'll say they don't believe the militia fired that shot, but a shot was fired. One of those troopers, believing he might have missed the signal to fire, he fires. And then others fire, and a ragged volley breaks out into the back of those dispersing militiamen. And then a full volley, and then they do what His Majesty's troops do best. They lowered their bayonets and they charged. In less time than it's taken me to tell you this much of the story, it was over. 8 men lay dead. More wounded. 5 pairs of fathers and son are separated by death. One man, dispersing as he was told, shot in the back, crawls up to his front porch, dies in his wife's arms. How did it come to this point? How did we end up trading shots with our own army? What could happen? What could be so terrible that we would be so disgruntled with our own government that we would feel the need to exchange firing with them? To understand that, we can't look at the previous day to see what made for the Lexington militia to be there. We can't look at the previous months or even years. We have to go back generations. Because you see, the Americas were a unique colony. Unlike other colonies where there was a heavy military presence and most of the local people had to be subdued, our colonies were mostly uninhabited except for the Indians, who really offered not much resistance. So Europeans came to the colonies because this was the one place they could truly be free. They came from all over the world. It did not matter what your family name was. It did not matter where you were born. It did not matter how much money you had. If you could reach for a dream, you had the opportunity to do so and take it. Something that was not available anywhere else in Europe. Anywhere else in the world, could be argued. So they flocked to the Americas. How badly did they want to get here? It's called indentured servitude. Someone else pays your way across the Atlantic and you become their slave for a decade to pay back your debt. That's how badly they wanted to come here. We were the original melting pot long before we were a country. And for the most part, Europe left us alone. We pretty much took care of ourselves. We governed ourselves. We set up our own economy. We built our own towns. We didn't ask for much from the kings who ruled over us, depending on what country or where you lived, whether it was France, Spain, England. We were self-supporting. We just went about our own way, and they let us. And it worked out well. It also meant that we had generations of being free. It was bred into us at that point, where it didn't matter what class we were. We were free. Well, Europe, loving to fight wars the way they do, it seems like they could find a reason for anything back then. They ended up in arguably the first world war of its time. They called it the 7 Years' War. We called it the French and Indian War. The problem with that war was, while it settled the issue of who controlled the colonies, it bankrupted the countries who fought it, including England. England was running out of money, and it was running out of money fast. There was a worldwide recession. The king was spending a lot of time sending his troops throughout his empire to subdue rebellion. Riots were happening in the streets. It was not a pretty picture. They needed money, and all eyes turned to look at the colonies because our economy was doing well. Two of the busiest seaports in the world were on the east coast of the Americas. Capitalism and freedom were working, and they wanted a piece of that pie. They wanted some of that money. There were a lot of restrictions in place. There was a lot of things happened. To make the story shorter, there were several attempts to tax us. We all know about the stamp tax, the sugar tax, right? Right. Every piece of paper that was official, whether it's wedding license, land deed, sell a horse, you had to pay for a stamp to be put on it. A little bit of money for Parliament lined their pockets. Sugar tax. We imported a lot of sugar into this country to make rum. They say that the Royal Navy floated on a sea of rum, and we were the spigot. We learned real quick how to smuggle sugar into this country. And what we couldn't smuggle, we found the right people to bribe so that we didn't have to pay tax on it. So there wasn't a lot of money to be made taxing sugar. There were several things that happened. All of them made us angry because while we didn't mind paying taxes, we wanted to have a say in it. We wanted to participate in the decision to tax us or not. We tried to get a seat in Parliament. Benjamin Franklin was in London for over a decade trying to get us a seat in Parliament. The Lords were not interested in the colonies and what our opinions were, and they were even less interested in having us take part in the decision-making process. And this all started to pile up on us. There was not a lot of support for any of these taxes. Most of them were withdrawn, except for one, the tea tax. And we know the fuss that caused. The Boston Tea Party, right? Everybody knows about the New York Tea Party, too. Boston Tea Party wasn't the only one. And we dressed like Indians as a disguise, is what you've been told. And that's not really true either. Everyone knew who was on those ships. They knew who the organizers were. They knew them from the taverns where they got the crowd fired up before they marched down to the wharf. We dressed as Indians to make a point. Because at the time, the American Indian was considered the freest man on earth. If you look at the political cartoons of the day, the colonies are always represented by an Indian maiden. We dressed as Indians because we wanted to do this to the king. Free men were throwing your tea in the bay. Free men were not paying your taxes. All of this came to a head in the sense that they ordered for Boston to be blockaded. They wanted to make a point of us, make a point to us. They were going to hit us where it hurt, break our trade, blockade the port, nothing comes in, nothing goes out. Well, everyone here, I'm sure, hopefully, played that game in grade school where the teacher walks up to the kid in the very front row and whispers something in their ear, and they whisper it in the kid next to them, and works its way all the way back to the end of the room. And then you ask the person at the end of the room, what did you hear? And the stories are not even close. And that's what happened here. They barricaded or blockaded Boston. They put in a military governor, General Gage. By the time the word had spread to the frontier, they said that Boston was being burned and being shelled by the Royal Navy. Well, everyone flocked to Boston to rescue it. From a long way, tens of thousands of men flocked to Boston, armed Indian fighters. They showed up at Boston and found out Boston wasn't burning at all. Boston wasn't being shelled. It was just a blockade. Phooey. They went home. But the point of what happened was not lost on General Gage, because he woke up one morning, king of all he surveys, blockading Boston to bring us to our knees, and he looks up in the heights overlooking Boston and sees that he's now outnumbered. That the colonists can raise an army bigger than his. And he tells Parliament that. He says, if you want me to subdue these people by force, I need 20,000 soldiers at least. Parliament says you're not getting them. You have a problem with these militia. If you have a problem with these people, simply take their arms away. Take their powder. So that's what he set out to do. And he was successful the first time. He sent a detachment to a town. They walked into the town on Sunday morning. They get there before dark. Everybody goes to church. They go into the community powder house because everybody stored their powder in the same place. If you cook by an open flame and you read by candlelight, you don't really want to have a lot of black powder laying around your house, so you keep it in a community powder house. They walked in, they took all the powder, and they walked out. And when we found out, we were furious. It was our powder. How dare the king walk in and steal our powder? It wasn't going to happen again. And Boston immediately set up a committee of observation. And they had a network of Sons of Liberty, they called them, those patriots loyal to the cause, who watched all the troop movements. They kept track of everything that was happening around Boston, and they reported back to a central place where notes were kept. Tactics were figured out. And when they realized that General Gage was going to send another detachment out to another town to take their powder, when that detachment got there, the powder was gone. We got there first, and we took the powder and sent it farther away. Tried it again, failed again. By this time, General Gage is getting more than a little bit upset. And he realizes that there are spies everywhere. He can't make a move. He thinks there might be spies within his own people. So he has a secret plan. He's not going to go for the small amounts of stores outlying in Boston. There was nothing in Boston. He already paid his officers to go buy everything he could find, every gun that they owned, every bit of powder that they had. He was going to go deep into the countryside, where he thought we had started to accumulate all these bits of powder, all these arms, cannons that we had been keeping from him. He sends scouts out down the road to start monitoring traffic on the road to see who's moving, who isn't, especially to look for dispatch riders carrying news. And then he sets up a secret plan. He doesn't tell any of his officers but one. And instead of marching a detachment out all together where everyone can see them leave, he takes his elite troops from each regiment. He takes what they call grenadiers, big burly guys like him. Lost him for a second. And he takes light infantry, little thin, quick-moving guys. They actually had lighter weight shoes, coats, shorter muskets so that they could move fast. They were skirmishers. He takes those from each regiment throughout Boston, small groups, and he assembles them at night is going to be the plan. And he's going to row them in boats across Back Bay out of Boston so no one sees them go through Boston's main gate. From there, they're going to go to Concord, where he has intelligence that they have 2 cannon, a large store of muskets, powder, and supplies for the militia. Now, he's been given instructions from Parliament that if he happens to stumble upon John Hancock or Samuel Adams, 2 of the local rabble-rousers, they're to be arrested. But he's less concerned with them at this point. He passes the orders on, but he doesn't make any special plans for it. When he's confident in his plan and he thinks that he's got it sorted out the way he wants it, he calls the commander that he's going to send, Colonel Francis Smith. Now, Colonel Smith was not what you would say an experienced combat officer, But he was very cautious, very congenial. Gage thought that would be appropriate in this time because he didn't want to cause any trouble. He wanted to send a thinker. So he picked Smith. He gave Smith the plan. Smith began to make his preparations. Meanwhile, this committee of observation is still watching everything that's going on. You can imagine what it would be like as a British officer walking around Boston at the time, and every time you go somewhere you think you're being followed. Someone's watching what you're doing, and that's exactly what was happening. Little bits of information began to trickle back in to the organizers, the Sons of Liberty. Little things like officers coming to dinner and telling the local boy, have my horses ready because I'll be leaving and I'll be out tonight. Little bits of information. All these little pieces of information came back to a Dr. Joseph Warren of Boston, who was the High Son of Liberty. And he starts to piece together the details, and he realizes Gage is getting ready to do something. And it's going to be big because we have all these different units throughout the garrisons in Boston are starting to get active. Well, he has a source that he can go to. The problem is this source can only be used one time. Because once he goes to this source, that source will never be usable again because everyone will know where he got his information. But he decides that this is important enough, it's worthwhile to do. And he goes to this source and he lays out what he thinks is going to happen. And the source concurs and says, yes, that is what's going to happen. In fact, it's a larger force than you think. It's going to be over 800 men. And they're also looking for Hancock and Adams. Now, we don't know the name of this source. Dr. Warren kept that secret. As he gave his word, he took it to his grave, the name. But we think we understand by piecing our little bits of information together. You see, General Gage's wife, Margaret Kimball Gage, was born in New Jersey. She was a colonist. She was also loyal to the cause of freedom. And shortly after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, she was unceremoniously loaded onto a ship and sent to England and never allowed to return to her mother country. I understand that she and General Gage remained estranged for the rest of their years. So we believe that that's where Dr. Warren got his information. And once he knew what was going to happen, he called for his system to come alive. See, he had two men that he could count on, William Dawes and Paul Revere. They were both going to leave Boston with the news. Revere had already set forth in a plan. He had a mass of people arranged throughout the area. They already knew what to do and how to do it to spread the word like a call tree. Just in case Dawes couldn't get out of Boston and Revere couldn't get out of Boston, Revere had arranged for 2 lanterns to be hung in North Church steeple. Everybody knows why 2, right? 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. It was always going to be 2 if by sea. You see, Boston at that time was surrounded by water. You couldn't leave Boston without being seen because you had to go through a narrow isthmus of land called the Neck. So it was always going to be 2 if by sea. But the lanterns were hung in the steeple, and patriots in Charleston were watching. When they saw those 2 lanterns, they dispatched riders. History has kept their names from us, but they began to spread the word. William Dawes, who was actually quite adept at getting through the gate when he wasn't supposed to, but he was a tanner, and he made a lot of trips into the countryside, so the guards were used to him. Somehow he managed to get out, and he went to spread the word. Revere had a little bit of more tortuous route, circuitous route. He was going to sneak down to the wharf on the north end of Boston where a boat had been secured for him. He was going to be rowed across Back Bay, dropped off in Charleston where a horse would be waiting for him. Now you would think that that would be easy enough done, except that between Boston and Charleston was something called the HMS Somerset, the biggest British battleship in the colonies at the time. And she was there to make sure nobody left Boston by boat. and Revere had to get past it. Now you can go on the internet and you can look this up. It's not folklore and it's not an old wives' tale, but there actually was a unique position of the moon at that time. And the moon cast a long shadow all the way across Back Bay from the high end of Boston. And Revere was rowed through that shadow so that the watches on the Somerset would not see him. Problem was, that shadow went right past the Somerset. Revere tells us they could read the name on the ship and they could hear the watches speaking. But he made it across, where he was given a fine horse, Brown Beauty, the best horse in the colonies at the time, they say, and he set off. We now have Dawes, who's left through Boston Neck. We have Revere, who's left through Charleston, and we have other unnamed riders who've left through Charleston. And each of these riders knows exactly what they're supposed to do. They go to the next town and they alarm this person. That person goes to the next town and alarms these 2 people. They go to the next town and alarm these 3 people. And the word spreads. And the word that they spread was not that the British were coming, it's that the regulars were out. The regulars were marching. Revere tries to make a straight line to Lexington, believing that Hancock and Adams are there after having left Boston when it was blockaded. He isn't able to do it. He runs into a horse patrol, but because he's been given arguably the best horse in Boston at the time, he's able to outrun those English horses on his strong American steed. And he has to take a circulus route all the way north and then come back down to Lexington. He arrives, it's nearly midnight in Lexington. He alerts the local sheriff. He goes to the house where Hancock and Adams are staying. And he goes to bang on the door to tell them the news. The sergeant at arms from the militia who's there to guard the house, he gets quite upset because we've got this strange guy showed up in the middle of the night, starts making all sorts of fuss. A window gets thrown open and someone complains about the noise, and Revere simply answers, "Noise. You'll have noise enough because the regulars are out." Hancock recognizes who Revere is, lets him in. He gets the whole story. He has a letter from Dr. Warren explaining 800 men under the command of Colonel Francis Smith are headed for Concord to take the militia stores, muskets, powder, and 2 cannon. And if they find Hancock and Adams, they're to be returned to Boston for trial. You can imagine Revere is quite emphatic that you need to get going quickly. They're still not certain. And about that time, Dawes shows up with another copy of the letter and exactly the same story. They decide something does need to happen. Captain Parker calls out the local Lexington militia, their Lexington training band. Revere takes a few moments to gather his thoughts, rests for a while. He and Dawes finally set out on their own. They're still supposed to go to Concord. They don't get very far out of Lexington before they run into another rider, Dr. Samuel Prescott. Young Dr. Prescott, he's been courting a young lady in Lexington, a Miss Lydia Mulligan, and she has just agreed to become his bride. So he's in quite a good mood. He's riding home to Concord, runs into Revere, Dawes. They get to chatting. I'm sure it's a little tense, a little testing of the waters back and forth before they figure out that they're all on the same side. Prescott offers to ride with them, and Revere is more than happy to have him because he knows the roads. He's well mounted because the doctors then, they all made house calls. They had good horses, and he would have been an accomplished rider. And would also add a little credence to their story if they show up with a respected local man when they get to Concord. So they agree to take him with them. And they head out. They don't get very far before they run into one of those patrols that Gage has set out. They see one man in the moonlight farther up ahead on the road. Revere has already had good success outrunning these patrols once, and he's willing to try it again. He's got faith in his horse. And he tells them, we're just going to keep going. They get a little closer, and that one man becomes two, and then three. When it gets to the point where Revere isn't certain that they should pursue anymore, he reins in, and they're getting ready to turn around and leave. And by that time, these scouts, knowing how this is going to work, they have men behind them at that point, and they're trapped. They grab their horses by the reins, and they start to lead them into a pasture where they're going to be questioned. There are already other people who are out traveling that night in that pasture at the moment. As they start to go through the gate, Revere leans over to Prescott and whispers, "Put on. Put the spurs to your horse." And that's exactly what they do. Prescott immediately puts the spurs to his horse. And I would imagine an accomplished rider on a horse that he spends every day on, he just leans forward, goes light on the reins, and just holds on. Gives the horse his head, let him run. Horse makes it all the way across that pasture. He's over a stone wall, and he is gone into the dark before the soldiers even know what happened. What they discover is that while they're watching Prescott disappear, Dawes has gone off in the opposite direction. Dawes doesn't get very far before he's unhorsed, and he's done for the night. Revere has tried to make it out as well, and he runs into more guards. They take him by the reins, they take his horse back over, they take him off of his horse, and they demand to know who he is. Who are you? Why are you out here this time of night? And what are you doing? He's not quaking in his boots like they expect. In fact, I imagine if you've seen his portrait, he probably had that same grin that your kids have when they know they got away with taking that cookie. And he looks up at them and he says, "My name is Paul Revere of Boston." And they know who that is. They know the troublemaker Paul Revere. Every officer knows the name of Paul Revere. And he says, "I am out warning the countryside that your General Smith, or your Colonel Smith, is marching 800 men to Concord. But I've got news for you. When he gets to Lexington, he's going to find 500 armed militia. And that will be the end of his night." As they press for more, Revere gives them complete details. He holds nothing back. He figures at this point, his best bet's to tell the truth. Get them worried. He exaggerates a little bit maybe, but lets them know what's happening. Well, the officer in charge of this has got to think about this for a moment, and he steps aside with the rest of his men, and they go to discuss this matter. This Revere guy, this troublemaker, is he telling us the truth? Is this really what's happening? Because they don't know anything about this super secret plan that Smith didn't tell anyone about. And as they step off to the side to think about it, an amazing twist of fate happens in Lexington. Remember, before Revere left, he had told them what was happening. Captain Parker had called out the Lexington militia, called out the training band, and they had all come into town. Now, standing around on a cold April evening, a cold April Tuesday evening in the middle of the week, in the middle of this giant training field, the men are thinking there's a better place to be right now. Captain Parker tells them, "Those of you who live in town, you may go home. But those of you who don't, I need you to stay around town and listen for the sound of the drum, and we'll call you when we need you." And they look over, and there's the tavern. Now, a tavern back then is a little bit different than what we call it now. It'd be, there's IHOP. And that's where they head. The men go there because they want to get inside, get warm, get a little something to drink, something warm. Problem is that they've all loaded their muskets. And how do you unload a musket? I see a couple people grinning. They know how you unload a musket. Exactly. You shoot it. So that's what they do. Except that you would think men would be careful and maybe we'll go out behind the barn so we don't wake anybody. No. 70 men all get together. They woke up in the middle of the night and they're going to have to stay in town. They're going to wake everybody up. And they start firing in volleys before they step through the door into the tavern. And that's what these British officers hear. Revere has told them that Smith is going to run into armed militia in Lexington, and they hear from Lexington volleys coming, and they think, okay, this guy's probably telling the truth then. We need to do something. They keep Revere off his horse, they give his horse to a sergeant, and they start heading back to Lexington. The closer they get, the more unnerved that they get. Daylight is coming. Revere manages to slip away from them. He goes cross country, straight shot. He's going to stay off the twisty, curvy roads. He's headed straight for Lexington because remember, he hasn't seen Hancock's carriage go by yet. Hancock and Adams are supposed to be leaving Lexington, and he hasn't seen them go by, which means they're still there. He needs to go get there and warn them. He makes it to Lexington just in time to see that patrol ride right on through without him, but they don't stop. They're off to go find Smith and warn him. Revere goes into the tavern to find everybody all fired up. What's going to happen? What's going on? Realizes that Hancock and Adams are still here. He finds them and says, you have to go, and you have to go now. They could be here at dawn. We don't know. You need to get out of here. He finally convinces them to leave. As they leave, Hancock's aide approaches Revere and says, and I imagine Revere by this time sat down by the fire in one of those recently emptied chairs and finally taken his boots off, tells Revere, we have a problem. Hancock left without his trunk. Revere is okay, he doesn't have a change of underwear. I don't understand what's going on. He says, no, he has a large oak trunk bound in leather, and it has all the paperwork for the Sons of Liberty. It has where all the munitions are stored. All the members of the Continental Congress. The names of all the militia leaders who are loyal to the cause. All the Tories. Everything the king needs to put an end to the Patriot movement is in that trunk. Cannot be allowed to fall into their hands. Revere and the aide find the trunk. It's on the second floor. Revere tells us in his diary, as he and the aide are struggling to get the trunk down the stairs, they come to the top of the landing. Revere looks through the window and he can see over on the green, those 70 men are starting to fall out. Just barely make them out in the dark. And he can see to the other side, as he described, a long silver snake. And it was 800 polished bayonets in the sun by these troopers marching to Lexington. Revere and the aide, they get the trunk down the stairs. They start to take it through town. Revere actually goes right through the middle of the green, through Captain Parker's men as they're forming up on the green. They make it over a stone wall and disappear into the woods, as Revere tells us that he hears the shot. And then we know what happens next. He's not the only one that heard that shot. Colonel Smith heard it as well. There's not supposed to be anything happening in Lexington. His order is to go to Concord. And now he's heard shooting. Now he's heard volleys. He rides ahead to the column, reels his horse onto the green, only to discover that his troopers are rushing through the town, kicking indoors. There doesn't seem to be any control. It's chaos. He's got dead militia laying in the grass, wounded militia crawling away, and he needs to get this under control. So he finds a drummer, because then everyone listened to the drum. That was their communication. And he has that drummer beat to muster, which tells the men to fall into formation. And as soon as that drummer starts beating, all the men stop what they're doing, and they all come back onto the green, and they start to fall back into formation. And Smith asks that question that every commander wants to know when something went wrong, is what happened here? Jesse Adair's orders were simply to secure the road to Concord so that the column could pass, not to enter the green and start a confrontation. But Jesse Adair, a young, hot-headed Irishman, was looking for a way to get that honor, and he couldn't pass up the opportunity when he saw those militia standing there. I'm supposed to secure the road. I'll secure it. I'm going to get those guys out of here. And that's exactly what he did. Smith is like, this is not good. He then finally tells his officers what their orders actually are. And the officers are unanimous. We need to go back to Boston. because this is no longer a secret expedition. Everyone knows we're out. They knew we were coming. We can hear the alarm guns. We can hear the church bells. By now it's daylight. They can see militia moving through the trees. They know that secrecy is lost, and they've drawn first blood. They need to go back. Smith won't hear of it. For king and for country, we've got our orders to go to Concord, and that's exactly what we're going to do. But he needs to get all of his men under control, and the first thing he wants to do is make sure that they don't have another shooting that's not supposed to happen, and he wants to unload all his soldiers' guns. And how do we unload a musket? We shoot it. Now, nobody on the green that day, none of the wives, none of the children, none of the wounded militiamen had any idea that Smith actually had their best interest at heart when he gave the order for a victory volley. Huzzah! 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 And every trooper fired his musket. To them, what they saw as their relatives are lying in their arms, being bandaged, or being prepared to be buried, was a victory volley. The last thing Captain Parker sees as he escapes out of the north end of town with what's left of his militia, as he looks back onto the green and sees those family members, those neighbors, lying on the green. 3 huzzahs and a victory volley. And that moment would not be lost on Captain Parker. He'd remember it. Smith goes ahead and he heads out of town, gets his men back on the road and heads for Concord. And he's arguably the smallest group heading for Concord at that point in the morning, because by that time militia are streaming to Concord from all throughout the countryside, because that's their orders. They're headed for Concord. Smith makes decent time, but not enough time. He doesn't move as quick as he would like. The militia begin to assemble in town from all the surrounding communities, and they're all debating what to do. They just have their orders, but they don't really have any strategy. They have no tactics, no real orders. Some of the younger men, the Minutemen, the men who are ready to pick up and go in 30 minutes notice, young guys, they're ready to take the fight. They're like, why are we standing around here in Concord? The troopers are that way. Let's go get them. The family men, the regular militia, they're looking at it and they're saying, well, this is our town. Someone needs to stay here and protect our town. The older men, the over 50 crowd, the alarm listers they call them, most of them were experienced men. Several of them were old Indian fighters. Many had fought in the French and Indian War. They're looking at it and they're saying, town ain't no place to fight a battle, boys. Especially not when we're outnumbered. We need to go back up to our training hill. It's about a mile away, Punkatasset Hill. We can see the town from there. Let's let our numbers grow a little bit so we can at least even the odds. And in typical New England fashion, where every man has a say, they did all 3 things. The young men marched off down the road towards Lexington looking for a fight. The regular militia stayed in town to guard their town, and the old men said, we're going to go up on the hill and wait till we got at least the same number of people. Well, the young men found Smith's column quickly enough, and suddenly they understood what 800 was. They decided that they weren't ready for a fight just yet, but they weren't going to run either. They simply turned around, stayed in formation, and they marched right in front, just out of musket range. The people who lived in Concord said it was almost comical. As they came through town, they saw their Minutemen leading Smith's column to the fife and drum and marching in time, except that when they got to Concord, they realized that the militia had saw the wisdom in those old men, and they had left town as well, so the Minutemen just kept right on marching. And they headed for Punkatasset Hill. Smith gets his column into Concord, and he gives his men their orders. They're given pieces of paper, documents written by Tories, colonists that were loyal to the king. Tells them who has the muskets, who has powder, who has cannon, where these things can be found. And details start to go house to house to acquire these things. They find musket balls that have been stockpiled, and they throw all those into a mill pond. They found no muskets because there had been enough warning that the muskets had been removed. They had been taken to a place called Barrett's Mill. They went to the tavern where they'd been told that there were cannon, and they banged on the door. Tavern owners, I'm not open. Well, they banged on the door some more. And when he refused to open the door, two big grenadiers, big guys like him, they kicked the door down. And they demand from the tavern owner to know, where are the cannon? And his response, what cannon? They immediately show him the document they have. It says, this says you have 2 cannon. We want them. Where? Put a pistol to his head. Those cannon. They're right out back in a garden. He takes them out back, shows them the cannon. They dig the cannon up. The cannon have 2 big bosses on the side called trunnions, and that's how they mount it to the carriage. Without it, it's like a rifle without a stock. So they break the trunnions off to render those cannon unusable at that point. And this is what they're seeing throughout the town as they're rounding things up. They're piling up anything wooden in the middle of town and setting fire to it. Colonel Smith has taken another detachment of men, several companies, and he sent them out to guard the North Bridge because he sent another detachment beyond that to Barrett's Mill, Barrett's farm, to look for more supplies. But in town, they continue searching, ransacking. Meanwhile, up on Punkatasset Hill, those militia are starting to increase in number as more and more come in. The fire that they've set in the green starts to get a little out of control. They've cut down the Liberty pole, which is a large pole in the middle of town. If you look in old paintings, flags, things of that nature from New England, the Liberty tree, the big green fir tree, was a sign of liberty. A lot of towns had one in their main green. It was a meeting place. It was a marker. It was a symbol of freedom. Towns that didn't have one would put up a pole. That pole was that town's place. You could nail messages on it if you want. Got a horse for sale, looking for someone, you could put a message on it. They cut that down. That was the way for those soldiers to say, you don't have any freedom. We decide if you have freedom. We decide if you have liberty. And to prove it, we're going to cut down your liberty pole and we're going to burn it. Well, when that fire gets a little out of control, embers start to land on the meeting house. The women in the town tell the officers, says, you burn this town down, you'll be sorry. You're going to get your men and you're going to help us put this out. And that's exactly what happens. Oddly enough, at that point, the townspeople and those soldiers work together to save the town. Now, we've all seen a campfire. You get a nice, good, hot campfire and it's almost smoke-free unless you're comfortable in your chair and then it blows in your face. But for the most part, there's no smoke. But you throw water on it and you get a lot of steam, don't you? Those men up on Punkatasset Hill have been watching the town and all they can see are those red coats moving around a little bit. They can't see much else. But when they see that water hit that fire and they see that steam and it looks like white smoke, well, you can imagine the thoughts going through their mind. Now you get a group of people together and you get them fired up, you get them riled up, you get their blood worked up. And you do that 4 or 5 times and people, they get used to it. You can get people fired up really easy. But then when it comes time to do something, that's when the reality sets in. And I think that's what happened on Punkatasset Hill. Everyone was fired up. Everyone was ready to fight. Everybody was ready to go for those redcoats. But then all of a sudden, it became real. It wasn't just talk at the local tavern anymore. And they're standing there watching this. And a young man, Lieutenant Hosmer, who History tells us they considered the most dangerous man in Concord because he was charming, he was youthful, and the young men of Concord would follow him anywhere he went. And he spoke up to the commanders of the militia, and he said, "Will you stand here and watch them burn our town?" And that snapped them right out of it. They knew what to do at that point. Major Buttrick, who was in charge at that point, he turns around, looks at the assembled captains from all these militias from all around the surrounding area, and he asks a simple question of, who will lead us into town? Which is not uncommon, because back then it was considered a great honor to be first, and many companies would vie for that honor. But this was real. There was a fire, there were redcoats, there had been killings in Lexington. But one man, the captain of the Acton militia, Isaac Davis, he pulls out his sword and he says, "I have not a man who is afraid to go." Not a man who's afraid to go. It's a big statement. But he was telling the truth. And that was enough to make every militiaman up there want to go, because they knew the character of the man that Isaac Davis was. You see, Isaac Davis probably should not have been there that day. You could argue he had a better place to be. When the alarm call went out, when his militia showed up at his house, which they all knew where it was because they were the best trained militia at the time. They met there twice a week to practice marksmanship, not just marching, but marksmanship. They showed up at his house late at night, and they knocked on the door to let him know that the alarm was out. And what they discovered was Isaac and Hannah Davis were both awake. All four of their children were down with something they called canker rash. We call it a form of scarlet fever. It had a 50% mortality rate. At its worst, the children would run a very high fever, and you had two options, and none of them were the emergency room or ICU. The two options were put a cold cloth to their head and pray. And you wait and see what happens. You had a 50-50 chance of saving your child if you did that. And that's what they were up doing that night. His militia show up. They tell him that the alarm has been sounded. They're expected in Concord. Isaac Davis doesn't hesitate. He simply gets up, grabs his powder horn, grabs his musket, starts to assemble his gear. His wife Hannah gets up and does the same. No one speaks. She simply gets him his 3 days' rations he's supposed to take with him. Make sure his canteen is full. The men take some of Hannah's flour and they put it in their hair so that it looks like a powdered wig, because they want to look the best that they can. Then the men wait outside. Isaac, finally, I'm sure, is stumbling around in the house, maybe not moving as quick as he could. He finally goes to the door to leave, and he hesitates for a moment on the threshold. And he turns back to Hannah, and the only words he says are, "Take good care of the children." And then he turns and steps into the night. Hannah tells us in her diary that she believed it was the last time that she would ever lay eyes on him on this earth. So when Isaac Davis says, "I have not a man who is afraid to go," everyone on Punkatasset Hill knew what that meant. That they had the best militia in the area led by the best man, and they were all determined, and they were all committed. The militia began to assemble behind them. Major Buttrick led them, their little column, down towards the North Bridge. It's debated whether or not the tune you heard playing when you came in the White Cockade was played there or not by historians. They believe that a fife and drummer did play the White Cockade. As they are starting to march down the road towards the North Bridge, the young lieutenant who's in charge of guarding that bridge, he looks up. He's been told to protect the bridge from these farmers and shopkeepers, these rabble-rousers, these hill folk. And when instead what he looks up and sees are several companies of trained military men marching in order. And they're not carrying hoes and hay forks. They've got muskets, cartridge boxes, canteens, matching uniforms. He panics. He's not a combat officer. He's what we would call a paper pusher today. We need paper pushers. That's the way the military works, but they are not to be guarding a bridge. He realizes that he's not in his best place to be. He calls his detachment back to the far side of the bridge, and they begin to pull up the planks. Well, they're on Major Buttrick's farm. That's his bridge, and they begin to yell down at those troopers, said, "Leave the bridge alone. That's our bridge. You have no right to tear that up." The officer down at the bridge, he instructs his men to fire one volley into the creek so that those militiamen will see that they're firing ball, not blanks. They're going to shoot to kill. The militia don't stop. They keep marching in perfect order. Finally, that young lieutenant, unexperienced lieutenant, has his men fire a volley. Now, in those days, you had a paper cartridge with a ball in the end of it, and you bit the paper off with your mouth, and you put some into the priming pan of your flintlock, and you closed it. You put the rest in the muzzle, and you ram the ball down on top of it. Ideally, you want a very tiny bit of powder in that pan. But often, in the heat of battle, a lot of powder went into that pan, and you would get a huge flare. It would burn your face. So a lot of those troopers back then, they got in the habit of raising their musket and hearing the word fire would simply turn their head and pull the trigger. And when they did, they'd shoot high. It was common knowledge that troopers fired high the first time. And that's exactly what they did. That front rank let go of their volley and they fired high except for 2 shots. One of them pierced Isaac Davis's heart, and he was dead before he hit the ground. At that point, all of the men were in shock. They turned and they had seen what had just happened. Major Buttrick wields his sword and tells his men, "Fire! For God's sakes, fire as fast as you can!" And those men cut loose with 2 volleys. And instead of 2 volleys that are high and maybe somebody got wounded, no. These were men who were practiced in marksmanship. Their 2 volleys killed 40% of the leadership on that bridge, like that. More enlisted men wounded. These are guys who are used to trading 2 or 3 volleys before they charge each other and start clubbing each other with their muskets and stabbing each other with bayonets, because the bayonet was the weapon of the time. The musket was just there to thin the herd a little bit, break up the columns. The real fighting was done with that 18-inch long pointed blade. And these men standing there guarding that bridge, they suddenly look around and men are dropping. They had never seen anything like that. And they got out of there. Many of them threw down their muskets and they turned and ran. Major Buttrick takes his men on down to the bridge. They take over the bridge. By that time, the last of those troopers have left. He sets his men up on each side of the road back to Lexington, and they wait because there's still a detachment that's been sent to Barrett's Mill. Now that detachment goes to Barrett's. They don't find anything. They demand that Barrett's wife make them breakfast, which she does and refuses money, calls it blood money. She won't take it. They find nothing. They go to march back to Concord. And as they do so, they walk past a hillside. There's a field. And they see a couple young boys up there plowing. It's April. It's time to break that sod the first time. And the boys wave down at the soldiers on the road. And the soldiers wave back at the boys up in the field. What they don't see is that there's a row of muskets lying there. And as the plow passes over, one boy kicks a musket in the furrow, and the next boy kicks the dirt back on top of the musket. The muskets they were looking for were being planted as seeds of liberty on that farm at that time. They make it to the North Bridge. They realize that something's obviously not right when the only British soldiers they find there are dead and wounded. They see the militia on both sides of the road. The officer makes, and I would love to know exactly what he's thinking as he's marching up. By now he's been up 24 hours. He's hot, he's sweaty, he's tired. They found nothing. He's marching down this road. He expects to find more soldiers, and instead what he finds is a bunch of militia. And the soldiers that are in the road are dead. He's missed a fight, and he has to get past these militia to get back to Concord. And he makes an amazing decision in that he does not attempt to engage the militia. They have several methods of marching back then. One of the methods is an easy walk. The men don't have to stay in time. They can hold their musket any way they want. They just walk. It's meant to conserve energy. It also keeps you from having that clump, 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 clump that you can hear for miles. And he keeps his men marching just like that. And they go right down the road. And you remember what their orders were. Captain Parker gave them to them on Lexington Green was, do not fire unless fired upon. That young officer at the North Bridge fired first. But these men coming back from Barrett's, they don't fire. Major Buttrick lets them pass unmolested. They make it into Concord. They have finally accomplished their mission and they can go home. Colonel Smith lets his men eat, makes some last-minute arrangements, dilly-dallies too long in Concord. Meanwhile, there's still militia arriving at Punkatasset Hill. He finally goes to leave Concord, and as he's marching this long two-column row of men out, the militia are coming onto the green or onto Concord right behind him, just outside of musket range. And at this point, those old Indian fighters got what they want. They got a fair fight. The militia equal Smith's column. And they're ready for it. They follow his column out of Concord. It's early afternoon by now. It's hot. They're all marching in wool uniforms. As they're going down the road, they start to see militia up and down the hillsides. They're running. They're following them. Bird dogging them is a nice term people like to use. Smith has taken his light infantry, his fast guys, and he's pushed them up the hills, told them, get up on the hills, push those militia back. Keep them away from my column. I don't want anybody in musket range, because all we got to do now is get back to Boston in one piece. And that works. The militia that are following are just outside musket range, and those skirmishers, those light infantry, keep those guys up on the hill just out of musket range. And then they come to a place called Miriam's Corner. Probably the most forgotten about place in American history. Miriam's Corner, there's a small bridge over a creek. A cut, really. Problem is that bridge will not support this massed column going across it. The men have to stop and narrow the column down. And remember those skirmishers up on the hill, they have to come down and cross the bridge. Well, what would happen if all of us got up out of our seat at the same time and tried to fit through that door? It's going to back up. And that's what happens at Miriam's Corner. As this group starts to go across that bridge and the column starts to back up, the men who are walking near the end of the column, they start getting a little bit closer, steps start getting shorter, and finally they grind to a halt, and they're waiting their turn. And that very end company on that column comes to a stop. And they turn, and they look over their shoulder, and those militia aren't stopping. They're still coming. The officer at the end of the column realizes that at some point they're going to get in musket range, and he wants to be ready, and he has a few of those men at that last company assemble into a firing order, and they're prepared. As soon as that militia comes down that road and they get within range, they're going to open fire. He's not the only one watching what's unfolding, though. All up and down that road, there's militia companies watching this who've been pushed back, but they're watching. One particular group is watching what's happening. And they do something that has become truly, uniquely American. Their orders were, do not fire unless fired upon. which means that they have to sit on that hill and they have to watch that company on the road take a volley. They have to sit by and watch them get shot at before they can do anything. Now, they don't even know those guys. We have groups coming from 20, 30 miles away. Those are not their neighbors. This is not like Lexington Green. They don't know those men. They're strangers to them. And the punishment for opening fire on those soldiers without being fired upon first is death. Any British officer could run those men over to a tree, put a rope over it, and hang them on the spot. No trial. No trial by peers, certainly. And they make the decision to fire first. They willingly put their neck in the noose to protect the freedom of a stranger. Isn't that about as uniquely American as it possibly gets? To risk your own life to help someone you don't know? And they opened fire. And that's where America was born. That's when Americans began acting like Americans. We fired first. And as soon as those militia did open fire, all throughout the hillside around that area, all the militia began to open fire. Luckily for Smith, he had enough experienced sergeants, non-commissioned officers, that they realized they were in a pickle. And they got their men moving as fast as they could, double time it, get across that bridge, let's get down this road, and let's get out of here because they are completely encircled. And they do. And they arguably save the column, as they do a few more times during the day, by understanding what's happening, and they hurry the men through the fire. As they go, every time they round a corner, they find another militia group, and they run into another ambush. They're kept away from water. Anytime they get near a well, near a farm, there's militia there waiting on them. Fights start to break out, little small firefights between the militia and those thirsty troopers. Morale begins to break down. It gets break down pretty good. Men are starting to just throw their musket down in a creek and run off down the road, because if they're unarmed, they can't be shot. They can only be captured. And they know this. So that means if they throw down their musket and run, get captured by the militia, they won't get shot and they will get a drink of water. And that's exactly what they do. At some point, the officers in the front of the column have to level their own muskets back at their own men and order them to get back in formation, or they will shoot them themselves. It's a mess, to say the least. Now, when they were marching towards Concord, when there really wasn't any fighting breaking out yet, if you step back to Boston, we're going to introduce a new player into the story here. Hugh Percy, Lieutenant General Hugh Earl Percy, 2nd Duke of Northumberland. I got it memorized now. It's a long name to fit on a check. I wouldn't want to sign it every time I went somewhere. He is just about to wake up, and he swings his lordship's feet out of his bed and drops them into his lordship's slippers to start his lordship's morning, I'm sure with his lordship's kippers and tea, and that's going to be the high point of his day, because it's going to go downhill from there. Because his adjutant comes walking in the morning, "Good morning, your lordship," and hands him his silver tray with his mail on it. And in that mail, he finds his orders that were supposed to have been delivered the night before. And those orders say that he is to leave before first light with nearly 1,000 men and 2 cannon and relief supplies to meet Colonel Smith in case he needs help. And he's just now gotten his orders. He immediately sends for his second command, and he dresses as hurriedly as I'm sure a couple helper men can dress a lord. And he starts to assemble his column. And he's delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed. He finally decides he's not going to take any spare ammunition. He will take the 2 cannon. He doesn't have time to wait for an ammunition train. And where is his second in command, who should be doing all this work? His name's Major Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, and he's already in the field with Smith. He's acting as Smith's second in command. It's another delay. Percy finally gets moving. But he's late connecting with Smith. he gets to Lexington. He gets the story of what's happened. He realizes this is no longer a secret mission. Everybody knows what's going on. He's hearing the alarm bells. By this time, he can see militia streaming through the countryside. He goes to leave Lexington, and they're on a small rise as the road drops off towards Concord, and he gets there, and what does he see? One thing that a decorated combat officer never hopes to see. He sees his army in chaos. Officers having to level muskets at their men to keep them in line. They're in chaos. A trained professional army by shopkeepers and farmers. He has the 2 cannons set up, and they begin to send rounds down the sides of the road to try and break up the militia, and they successfully do that. He has his column open up in the middle to accept Smith's men as they come running up the road. They fall down at his men's feet and thank him for saving their mortal souls from shopkeepers and farmers. This is what Percy sees. He discovers that the command is pretty much without a commander at this point, because you remember Captain John Parker? You remember Captain John Parker and the last thing he saw as he left Lexington? A victory volley. He rounded up the rest of his militia. He got the men that were still able to fight, and they were waiting on that road because he knew they were going to come back. And he didn't have any particular soldier that he was wanting to shoot at or pick a fight with or angry with. He had one man in that column that he blamed for what had happened. That was Colonel Smith. And the Lexington militia waited till Smith's portion of the column came along. And then they rose up and fired. And they unhorsed Smith with a musket ball to the leg, killed his horse. Many of the men around him injured and wounded. Smith is out of the fight at this point, and there's a marker there, and that place is still called Parker's Revenge to this day, but I doubt many people know why. Percy looks at the situation around him and realizes he's in a mess. Again, he dallies. Takes too long. Takes longer than Smith did in Concord. But he gets some first aid for his men. He gets them fed. They round up, scavenge, steal any horse, wagon, carriage that they can get to put the wounded on. The wounded officers. Enlisted men are expected to make do as they can. And he begins to leave Lexington, head back for Boston. But he's not the only new character to arrive on the scene. Dr. Warren, amazingly, gets out of Boston in broad daylight. And history doesn't tell us how he managed it, but I would love to hear the story someday. But he makes it out, and he shows up in Lexington. At the same time, the commander of all the militia in that area, General William Heath, a self-proclaimed fat, balding farmer. He didn't have any airs about him. He was a history nut, we would call him today. He read a lot of history. He was especially interested in tactics. And he knew that there was a great source of information on tactics in Boston with all those officers running around. And anytime he could find one in a tavern or a dinner house, he would buy him something. Tell me a story. And he'd ask him questions. What would you do if? What are your orders if? General Heath had a really good idea what was going to happen. And he was right. Percy, seeing this long drawn-out column of men in column of twos, knew that when he doubled the size of that column, it was going to get even longer and harder to protect. And Smith's men were already exhausted, low on ammunition, and he didn't bring any. So what he does instead is he forms the companies into boxes to march down the road, which is wider at this point now. And he puts Smith's tired men inside the box and his fresh men on the outside of the box. So that if they need to, they can fire. And if they have, they can trade places so that there's always a loaded musket on the outside of the box. And that's how he leaves Lexington, headed for Boston. And the good General Heath figured that out. He saw that coming. But he had a better plan. He stole something, borrowed, learned from the ancient Greeks called the moving circle of fire. And as soon as he arrives in Lexington and sees what happens, he sends word to Warren, and they start sending word down to the militia. Militia that are arriving, heading towards Concord, looking to get into the fight when they see it's at Lexington. They're telling them, stop. Don't come any farther, or even turn around. Go farther down the road and wait. Just wait. The column is coming to you. And when it arrives, put a volley in the front. Put a volley in its side as it passes, and give them a parting volley as they go by. And that's exactly what they do. And then as soon as the column is gone, run around and get in front of it and do the same thing again. So the first 50 men who meet them run around and join the next and become 100. They run around and join the next and become 200. They called it the moving circle of fire. And interestingly enough, though they never met, Lord Percy called it almost exactly the same thing. That's how well it worked. He can't take that column 10 feet down that road without receiving fire from all sides. Whether it be a small skirmishing group, or they come by an open field and find 100 men lined up in firing formation. Everywhere he goes, he's fired on. They make it into the small towns of Menotomy and Camden. And the militia are doing the same thing there, except they're no longer 50, 60 yards away setting up their ambush. They're maybe 5, 10 yards away because the houses are so close to the road. Men are actually shooting from windows. Homeowners are shooting from windows. The officers in the front of the column have never seen something that we now call urban warfare. They were used to an open field where the two sides faced off, saluted each other, did honorable things, and then traded volleys while the young men went out and bayoneted themselves. They had no idea what this was, this style of Indian fighting. It became brutal. It became bloody. The majority of the death and the wounding happened in those areas on that part of the day. The officers, the young officers in the front of Percy's column, start to tell the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers, the sergeant said, if you see fire from a house, enter it, kill everyone inside, and burn the home. They wanted to put a stop to it. They make it through those small towns, and they're on the home stretch at this point. The only obstacle in their path to go up to Boston Neck and march through the main gate is the Charles River. And there's a bridge over that river. And the militia own that bridge. The militia have removed all the planks from the bridge. In the typical frugal New England fashion, they have stacked the planks quite neatly alongside the bridge. So the British engineers that discover that the bridge has no planks simply put the planks back on the bridge, report to Smith that the bridge is safe. We can cross it. We can make it to Boston. So you can imagine their shock when the next report Smith gets is that the bridge, in fact, is no longer safe to cross because while they were frugal New Englanders, they were more patriots. They went back, pulled the boards off, and this time they chucked them in the river. So there was no fixing the bridge. Smith is now cornered. Percy is cornered. Nearly 1,600 men. By this time, they've got easily double the number of militia behind them, and they're backed up against a river they can't cross. It's not a good picture, especially not for a combat veteran. He knows the seriousness of what's going on, but he has gotten word from some of his junior officers who have talked to some of the loyalist locals. And there's a small goat path, they call it, which to me, and I envision a little two-wheel path like you see, especially if you've seen Lord of the Rings, a little two-wheeled cart path running alongside a fence. It's not really marked, not really used much, but it's called Kent Lane. And he turns the column at the last minute and sends them up Kent Lane, takes them north towards Cambridge, where they can go to where Smith's men were originally dropped off in the boats, and maybe they can get rowed back across to Boston. And it works. It breaks them out of the circle of fire. It gives his column some relief. The militia who were supposed to be there were absent at the time. Their leader was not a coward, and he was not a Tory, but like many Americans at the time, because they were all Americans after Miriam's corner, he was not certain that war was the solution. Not yet, because they knew it was going to be fought in their own yards, their own homes, their own towns. And he wasn't positive that that was the best solution yet, and he stalled. Till finally his men told him, "You either lead us or we will go without you." And he finally agreed to lead his men, and they marched, and they arrived in time to see Percy's column pass away. Heath properly stops the militia. They know that when they make it to the heights, Charleston overlooking Back Bay, they'll be under the guns of the Somerset, and nobody wants to tangle with a naval barrage. And they also don't want a massacre. It's too important to make sure that the militia appear to be in the right. So they let them escape. Percy gets his men to the heights overlooking Back Bay. He gets his men rowed across to Boston. It's midnight before all the men finally arrive in Boston. It's morning before General Gage gets his report. General Gage gets a report of what a failure this mission was. And he gets to enjoy his report as he looks up, and the heights overlooking Boston are 14,000 militia, 14,000 armed fighters. In the morning of April 19th, Smith was the royal governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he had Boston in a blockade. He had his hands around Boston's throat. On the morning of April 20th, he was a trapped man, because now he was the royal governor of nothing, and his town was under siege. And he fully understood this. Now, we knew that several things had to happen for this war for independence to take place, for us to win our fight. And one of them was that we had to always be on the high moral ground. We had to put the enemy, the British soldier, in the wrong, and we had to keep him there. That was why we had the orders of do not fire unless fired upon. And we needed to get our story out first. So dispatches were sent up and down what is now being called Battle Road. Depositions are being taken from all the witnesses, the militia who fought, the British regulars who were captured and wounded. Everyone's deposition was taken. It was all assembled into a packet. And then the fastest boat on the eastern seaboard was collected up, a fast schooner, sloop. The packet was given to the captain, and he was told to take it to Ireland and then take it by horseback across Ireland, cross the Irish Sea, and take it to London. A nice, safe path, but do it as quickly as possible. And his ship was chartered and run empty so that he could sail as fast as possible. And the captain, understanding the importance of getting our story out first, he didn't stop at Ireland. He sailed right on into London. The information was given to the royal mayor of London, who was loyal to the idea that maybe the colonies should govern themselves, so that the first words about what happened that landed on the king and Parliament's eyes were our side of the story, printed in the morning paper. Weeks before General Gage's version of the story arrived, which we understand was a very terse, to-the-point military report and nothing more. No explanation for what happened. And it worked. We had to have that appearance that we were not just crazy rebels, that we were fighting for our freedom, and we were pushed too far. And that's what we got. Now, how many people heard this part of the story? How many of you knew that this is what happened? Did anyone know that this is how this country was born? It's not something that's told every day. It's not something that everyone gets to hear, and that's why we tell it, because everyone should hear it. And it was just the beginning. The war would drag on for 8 more years. But really, the people who were in charge of getting this going, the people who started it, the people who made the ball roll, they understood that winning the war was just the start. Because once we gained our independence, we had to do something with it. And the rest of the world was watching what they would later term that grand experiment. Can common people govern themselves? No one thought we could. Not without a lord or lordship to look upon us and tell us what to do. There was much debate in the constitutional conventions by all the delegates from each colony about what form of government should we have. How do we make sure that what has happened now doesn't happen again? How do we ensure our freedom and our liberty? We fought for it, now what? There was much debate. If you even remotely like history, I recommend the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, because while they're a little bit slow to get started, once you start reading them, they make Downton Abbey sound boring. And they're real. They're real. They're not a Hollywood script. They realized that the best way to protect the people from a tyrannical government, the best way to keep the people safe from their government, was to make a government that consisted of the whole of the people. That was the ultimate solution. That was the grand experiment. And that was what they did. Now, when the convention was over, and they finally had something that they thought all the colonies would ratify and call a constitution to bring this confederation of states together, they locked themselves up into the hall, closed all the shutters on a very hot summer so that they wouldn't be bothered because there was a crowd growing outside. And when they finally had something that they thought everyone would sign, when they finally had what they thought was going to be the solution, I can just imagine the first time you stepped outside that door knowing you didn't have to go back in. It was a hot day outside. That was still cool air. And it felt good. And the people were waiting to hear. They were waiting in particular for one man, Ben Franklin, because they knew that Ben Franklin would speak to them on their terms. He was Poor Richard. He wrote the almanac, and every home had a copy of the almanac. And he was asked, when he exited the hall, one woman spoke up and said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you given us?" And his answer was, "Very Poor Richard." And it succinctly rounds up the whole of the American Revolution and the constitutional conventions into one sentence. A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. Because while they understood that the only way to make the people safe from their government was to make a government of the people, they also understood that it only worked so long as the people behaved like a government. So long as the people participated in the government is the only way it would work. The minute the people sat down and did nothing, all was lost. That was the amazing part, that they understood that concept and that they were willing to take the risk. They had enough faith in us that they thought it was a good risk. We all have the ability to steer this country into any direction we want it to go. Those patriots that day died to give us that gift. The only question is, are we going to steer or are we going to sleep? We have our hands on the wheel. Steer or sleep, that's the question. Thank you for coming.